2, 1.
What's up, guys? It's Rowan.
Wait, there's a bit of a lag.
What's up, guys? It's Rowan.
And Terry.
Here from ArtofSmartTV with another episode of the HSC Economic Review, brought to you from COVID lockdown. Now, Terry, what on earth are we discussing in today's episode?
Well, I also wanted to start today's episode with a very special shout out to Zoom for making all of this happen, right? I know those of you who are studying at home probably have been using Zoom a lot. Us in the education industry have also been using a lot of Zoom. And, you know, that's why we're talking about this. The reason why we are using Zoom in the first place, we are doing an episode about COVID-19 and its impact on the global economy. Recently, we've just ticked over 5 million cases around the world. It's been dominating the media, the news, you know, since the start of the year. We've had, unfortunately, over 300,000 deaths. Huge impacts on the economy. Obviously the landmark event of 2020. So that is why we are just going to look at today the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy.
And I think it's important to highlight here that, you know, in the past when you've been looking at topic 1, right, which is the global economy for HSC Economics, the go-to case study has been the GFC. And I think what we're going to see here is that there is an update in the go-to case study, or at least now there is a really interesting comparative, because obviously we've got, you know, the GFC, which indicated in big ways just the sheer extent to the existence of a global economy and the transmission effect of conditions between countries. But we saw that play out over a couple of years, where we're seeing here with COVID-19, certainly transmission is the word, and we're also seeing it play out in a incredibly rapid period of time. So it's going to be a really interesting case study that I think is going to be able to really be used in a big way as part of both topic 1, global economy, but as we see in future episodes of HSC Economic Review, I think it's also going to feature really strongly as we look at topic 2, Australia's place in the global economy, how this is impacting Australia. And then, of course, with our economic issues and our economic policy management in how we respond to it. So it's really going to have quite far-reaching consequences across the entirety of the HSC economic syllabus. So the better you get your head around this, you know, I think the more sophisticated your responses are going to be when you get into trials and HSC.
And there's just so much information. So that's why I feel like we need to make a video like this to kind of help you guys just compartmentalize it, kind of break it down a little bit so you can see where it is all relevant. Otherwise, it just ends up becoming, I guess, a little bit of a big blob of COVID-19 knowledge, which you may or may not have difficulty applying.
Definitely. So jumping in, I guess, Terry, you know, an initial question. When we're looking at the impact of COVID on the global economy, I mean, where do we start?
Well, I think we should start with, you know, the international organizations that you guys have looked at in topic 1. One of them, the International Monetary Fund. They've posted their predictions on how GDP is expected to move this year. So at the beginning of the year, they had their initial pre-pandemic prediction of a 3.3% expansion, which would have been a little bit more than last year. So it was, if you remember some of our videos from the start of the year, which do feel like a long time ago, we were saying that, you know, the global economy was, you know, expected to recover slightly this year. Then, of course, we had coronavirus, and then we had a video then as well where we were saying, well, obviously we don't know. But as time has moved forward and we have started to see how governments and central banks have tried to respond to it, we have a better picture now. And so the estimate here is it will shrink 3% this year. Now, Rowan, how does this compare to, you know, you were talking about the GFC, other reference points that we have looked at in economics?
Yeah, so look, I think what's really interesting about this is that they're expecting it to be the deepest dive in economic growth globally since the Great Depression. I mean, if we think about it, during the global financial crisis in 2009, if you look at real GDP growth, year-on-year percentage change for the global economy in 2009, it was minus 0.1%. Okay, so there was an overall impact and it went just into negative figures. If we look at it for what is now being known as the Great Lockdown of 2020, it's negative 3%. So the pace of the change and the sheer size of it in terms of the impact on the global economy is unprecedented. Even going back to Great Depression, at the moment the figures are looking like it's going to be similar, but probably worse even. And that's pretty scary, I think, really, because if we think about it, they've gone from a 3.3% projected growth, right, to now saying it's going to shrink by negative 3%. So that's like a 6.3% turnaround in what has been, 3 months?
3 months, yeah.
Crazy. Absolutely nuts. Now, how does this play out, Terry? Because obviously that's at a global level, but I think clearly what we're seeing here is that, coronavirus is, I think, really perhaps causing the differences in categories, right, of economies to become perhaps more clearly seen in terms of the impact it's having on growth rates. So how is this impacting different categories of countries?
Yeah, so in your study of topic 1, you learned that you have the advanced economies, you have the emerging economies, and then you have, I guess, the developing economies. And so coronavirus does, as you were saying, it really exposed those differences because different economies are being impacted differently. Okay, and to kick things off, advanced economies are actually suffering the most dramatically, right? They're projected to have a decrease in GDP, in real GDP percentage change of 6.1%. Negative 6.1%. So they're going to be shrinking by 6.1%. This is, of course, led by the United States, the Euro region, Japan, the UK, Australia. Really, really bad. Now, the other thing I just wanted to point out is comparing this with, this is a real shock, not just necessarily a financial shock. Right? And so that's why that's one of my reasons for why I think this is more serious than the GFC, because it's affecting people's lifestyle. It doesn't matter if you're in the financial industry or not this time around. It doesn't matter if you're engaging in that market. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay? But however, emerging markets and developing economies really aren't feeling it as much, because if we remember from what you've looked at in topic 1, these are economies that were moving and developing faster anyway than the advanced economies. And so, in line with that, they also are going to be shrinking a lot less compared to the advanced economies, with projections of only negative 1% economic growth in 2020.
I think perhaps what's interesting as well with some of your developing economies is, to some extent, it's probably also not yet clear on, the degree to which COVID will impact them. And I say that because, if we look at the cases, right, globally, at the moment, the overwhelming bulk of cases are, in, Western Europe, the US, and as a result, we've probably got better modelling, and the IMF has probably got a better sense of modelling on impacts, where, the impact is yet to, I think, be determined when we start to look at, Latin America. Although Brazil's struggling and there's been some interesting policy decisions in Brazil which might exacerbate their recovery, it's unclear, particularly with sub-Saharan Africa, the sort of impact, particularly, in the sense of, well, they've already got perhaps a not so great health system already, high levels of poverty. How does this really exacerbate that? So I think what for me isn't really clear, and I feel like the IMF has probably been a little more optimistic, to be honest, when we start to look at particularly the developing economies category. I can certainly see the rationale for emerging. They've already had high growth rates. Even if those growth rates get hit by 5%, they're still coming out at maybe the negative 1, right? I can certainly see that. But I do have question marks about to what extent does it, have a long-term consequence for more of the developing economies in, unfortunately, potentially really further entrenching inequalities in the global economy, which again is part of topic 1. It's also a part of topic 1 that's often not well, I think, revised by students. If I'm being really honest,
I would argue it's because it's not well assessed, as in it doesn't really pop up that often.
Yeah, that's true. But I think this creates the opportunity, right, for some more assessment around that. And I think also some interesting data that students could be using then to sort of start to highlight, hey, we can see, you know, because particularly if we start to look at some of the reasons for differences in the global economy, you know, global trade architecture, financial architecture, global aid, you can start to see how, you know, COVID may cause that to stretch and actually create increasing inequality globally, which, you know, I think that's probably my concern, I'd say, at the moment. Particularly with
Can I just add one more thing onto that?
Yeah, go for it.
Like about the modeling, I also think there's a lower rate of testing in more emerging and developing economies, right? So the bulk of the testing is being done in advanced economies, and so therefore, obviously, that's why they're getting those more reported cases as well. And so I think that highlights another issue of just, you know, inequality and inequity of access to infrastructure and healthcare and whatnot in between economies.
Yeah,
so again, throws off our projections.
Pretty big, definitely. Now, let's keep on moving. So that's obviously at a big picture level where we're seeing really, you know, unprecedented levels of falling economic growth, you know, beyond GFC, similar to Great Depression and possibly beyond. Let's take a look at a couple of more specific areas now in the global economy. So what's been happening with the share markets, Terry?
Well, you've been following the news, it's just been a whole sea of red, right? You know, it's very sad, right? Because a lot of people are, you know, especially in Australia with the superannuation, right? The superannuation depends on the performance of the share market. So globally, right, the share markets have not fared well. And this should come as no surprise because share markets depend so much just, you know, on confidence and economic health, right? And so if the state of the economy isn't really particularly healthy, the share markets will often take a dive. And that's exactly what's happened. It's fallen by about 15 to 25%. I know, obviously, you know, the US stock markets, they were riding some pretty high highs before that, right? And so to have it all come crashing down, you know, pretty shocking stuff. So specifically, if we look at sorry if I screwed this, but is it Nikkei?
Yep. That sounds right to me. I'm certainly no expert on pronunciation.
Yeah, I'm not qualified to pronounce that correctly either. So that's had a drop of 15%. The Dow Jones in America with 18.5%, and the FTSE in London with almost 25%. So stock markets have not performed well. Now, are there any other kind of assets which have also, or commodities which haven't performed well?
Yes, I think probably the other big one has been oil prices. So oil prices are now 65% lower than they were in early January. I mean, if we think about it, it makes perfect sense. If all of a sudden, you know, cruise liners are no longer able to operate, we've got, you know, ban on most international travel, we've got, you know, overall less travel occurring, and that's even in cars.
Road travel, road traffic,
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think what we're seeing is massive fall in global demand for oil. Now, if you're environmentally friendly, you're probably cheering right now. It's been a fantastic outcome for the environment, but it does have interesting impacts on our oil prices. So 65% down. And what's really crazy, okay, is that there's even been in the case in the United States with a barrel of West Texas Intermediate, which is a particular oil commodity, that it actually turned negative for the first time in history. And what that means, just so that you get a bit of a sense, guys, is that the oil producer was actually paying buyers to take the oil. And that's simply because they had fears that they couldn't store it anywhere and they needed to just get rid of it because it was going to create bigger problems from a storage point of view. So crazy outcome. And it's funny because earlier in the year, Terry, we sort of talked about, you know, pre-COVID, that one of the things that could cause a global recession was an oil shock. Certainly didn't, of course, see COVID, but we've seen the opposite occur, right? Which is actually just absolutely collapsing demand. And to be fair, I think we're going to see really quite repressed oil prices, you know, for the next 12 to 24 months. Even as transportation starts kicking into gear, it's going to be at a lower level. There's going to be less transport. And so I think we'll see oil prices to be low, which, you know, is not necessarily a bad thing. It will have a deflationary impact, certainly, in terms of, you know, prices in the economy. And when people's earning and income and disposable income is also falling, you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So, you know, I guess that's probably a nice segue, Terry, though, which is what's been happening at a global level with unemployment.
Well, yeah, as you said, Rowan, there's a good reason why there's such a low demand for oil at the moment. It's because people don't need to move, right? More often than not, people are moving because they need to go to work, right? And unfortunately, global unemployment levels have also dramatically increased, right? Just because of the shutdowns that have been announced by governments, and obviously in a shutdown, you can't go to work, right? And so for a couple of examples here, I know the United States has been hit pretty hard, right? So they've shot over 10% unemployment. The Euro area, which is already, symptomatic with pretty high unemployment rates to begin with, also over 10%. In Australia, right, quite an interesting case, so we will talk about that in our Australian video, right? So there is plenty to dissect there, but pretty much all around the world, you're getting quite a bit of an increase in unemployment.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting because unemployment is also a bit of a lag indicator. And so the fact that it's hitting very quickly is indicative of the rapid shutdown. But I think the concern that's going to sit, and it's certainly something we're going to unpack more when we look at the impact of COVID on Australia, is that unemployment is a lagging indicator, which means that even as your economy recovers, it can take quite a long time for unemployment to actually get back to sort of, acceptable levels, right, in terms of nearer to your objectives. And, you see that, throughout history, where there's often 2 or 3 years after an economic recovery, after a recession, you've still got quite large levels of unemployment. And so I think that's one of the big concerns here, is that this, very rapid increase may lead to quite sort of entrenched unemployment in the global economy over quite a period of time, and remains to be seen, but I think certainly a big concern. Now, maybe what we should do, Terry, is also dive in and look at some specific economies and sort of regions, right? Because as we've talked about, it's impacting different countries in different ways. So, you mentioned a little bit about the United States before. How is it impacting the United States? How are they responding to it?
Well, to answer the first part, how it's impacted them is the most in the world, right? Because they do have the most number of confirmed cases, and I believe also the most amount of deaths too. So it has been very unfortunate, to see how the United States has really struggled to cope with this crisis. But it's not through lack of stimulus, right? It's more so, I guess, with the way that things happened in terms of their lockdown. But they've been spending lots of money, in fact, right? So they've passed over $2 trillion in coronavirus aid, and I think there's still more bills to come, right? There's just, every couple of weeks there'll be more bills being introduced. But right now they've got $2 trillion passed just to help workers and businesses, give them the necessary aid just to make it through. They've got additional $310 billion in progress to provide low-cost loans that do not need to be repaid if there's certain criteria that can be met. But this might just not necessarily help some of the smaller firms, but some of the more medium to large firms. But just so much money being poured in, right? And so overall, I've seen lots of conflicting numbers. I think that's the issue with all of this, really, is that there's so many just articles and so many numbers that it can often get a little bit overwhelming, right? And so what would your advice be here? Like, when you see so much information, right? So we obviously know the United States is spending a lot of money. So what would you say, to a student, what number do you go with? Yeah,
I mean, look, I would in most cases pick one of two. One, if I can get access to what seems to be like an overall number, that's probably the default, right? Particularly because it's not Australia as well, it's another country, and you might be using it as a comparative. So in that case, I would be referencing the $2 trillion, right, that has been spent. That's probably the first. The second maybe is if I was wanting to speak more specifically about a policy and comparing it to a similar policy in Australia, I might reference something specific. So, for example, there was a $349 billion relief program for small businesses, which might be akin to JobKeeper in Australia, for example. So if I was wanting to make a comparison across country, I might then look at a specific. But to be honest, in most cases, the first option, just the big picture number, is going to be more than enough, particularly if it's a foreign country, and it's not your case study country, right? If it was your case study country, you would want to go a little more detailed than that.
And also, just to go on with that from a teaching point of view, teachers don't have the time to just independently review and audit every single statistic. As long as it passes what I like to call a realism test, right? Like, it sounds like it's really realistic. You're not saying like the US Senate passed a $200 trillion coronavirus aid bill, something that makes sense, even if you're a little bit off, right? I think they do allow for, I know I would allow a margin of error just to reflect the fact that, there's different times, right, where things are changing so quickly, right? So you may well have had a correct statistic. It might just be a couple of days out of date. And
I think that's a good point. Don't stress too much about, I've got to get the most up-to-date stats all the time, because clearly things are moving so quickly. I think one of the ways that you can handle that is when you do list a stat, particularly if it's, let's say, unemployment, because each month, globally and domestically, unemployment is going to be in a state of change. One of the things I would recommend, because things are changing so quickly, is if you have a stat for unemployment, let's say, for example, the US unemployment figure for April is 14.7%, right? So pretty huge. It's up from 4.4% in March, which was a 50-year low, right? So we've seen a 10% increase in a month, right? Now, that's probably going to get a lot worse, and they're expecting it's going to go to 20% and beyond, which is greater than, or comparable to Great Depression era for the US, where it reached 25%. Now, my point here is I would probably write 14.7% and then just in brackets write April 2020. So if you are concerned about, the fact that, the stats are changing so quickly, just let your teacher know when you're referencing it, well, okay, it's from this month. So that way then if things have changed and your teacher's reading it and they're like, well, this is not true. They're like, oh, okay, great, it was from April, great. I can see that, that was right. You've done the work.
True at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And that's pretty simple. It's not too challenging to do. It doesn't take up a whole lot of words in responses either, so you can keep it pretty tight. So I think clearly we can see the US is in trouble. As you said, Terry, the most cases, it's having a huge impact on their unemployment. Job losses in April alone exceeded the 8.7 million in the last recession. So that's what's crazy. They've seen, job losses in a single month in the US have exceeded the entirety of job losses during GFC, which goes to your point, Terry, that it's not just a financial crisis. It's got a much far-reaching consequence on, economies. What about China? I mean, there's been a lot of stuff going on with US and China. What's been happening with China, Terry?
Even Australia and China now. Yeah,
that's right.
But I think the key statistic that we got to take from China is that they've reopened their factories and their economy. They're allowing the travel of people between places, but they've reported that in the first quarter their GDP has shrank by 6.8%. So that's negative 6.8% in the first quarter of 2020. They were, however, forecasted to do positive growth of about 2.5%. So you can see that that's, if my math is correct, that's about a 9.3% swing. And so they've also been quite heavily affected as well.
To clarify, Terry, I think what the analysts were actually trying to do on that was, I think their growth was expected to be 5.4 for the year, right? And then they've gone backwards to 6.8, right? And analysts have now updated, well, because China, they were the first to have it in a big way, massive shutdowns, they're now reopening factories. The expectation is Chinese growth for the year, I think, will be...
for the year.
2.5, which, is relatively good. Compared to the state of the global economy right now, which I think is going to be interesting for China. I think because China have been using, and there's a lot of criticism right now about this. In some ways, China have been using their sort of stronger economic positioning because they've been able to come out, quicker and relatively more unscathed at the moment, as a way to really, position themselves economically in the global economy in a stronger way, and not always in a good way. I mean, and that's something that is interesting because obviously they've got their, their Silk Belt policy, where they make strategic investments into, countries, throughout the sort of Asian region and beyond. And that's a key way for them to then really build infrastructure assets and very strong connections so they can place economic pressure on countries, for certain outcomes they're wanting to seek. And Australia has certainly experienced that with our beef and our barley, and we don't have the sort of degree of Chinese investments that perhaps some of these other countries have had. And so I think what I've seen to be quite interesting with how China's responding is that now that they're sort of getting things reopened, the economy is going to see some growth. They've been quite, not aggressive per se in relation to this, but certainly out there in trying to offer support. That's been part of their Silk Belt policy. And on the flip side, there's now concerns that a lot of countries that are unable to pay these and are defaulting on them are actually going to result, in these loans that were required to build huge port assets and huge infrastructure. That actually China will then get significant equity ownership in a lot of these assets that wouldn't have otherwise been able to occur just due to how critical some of these assets are for, both sort of sovereignty and national economies. So interesting. I think it's going to be interesting at a geopolitical level how a lot of this plays out in terms of the differences in how certain economies survive and respond, and then what that means for a reshaping of the global geopolitics, essentially.
Yeah, so I think I definitely agree. I think that we have to really look at what's going to happen in the next 12 months or so, just because China really hasn't missed a beat, have they? They've just they've stepped in and they've that independent inquiry that we were looking at as well. They pretty much just shut us down, right? It was kind of scary, really, just to see whilst everybody was still struggling with this coronavirus, that they could move at the pace that they have. So it will be, very interesting to see. Did you have anything else you want to say about China? Or?
No, I was going to say, the EU is another interesting, region that's really struggling. I think, they've had fairly high cases, particularly France and Spain, clearly. They had already quite high unemployment in the area pre. So their unemployment across the EU was 7.5%, but there were big differences across member states of the EU. And so I think it's been interesting to see that, at the moment, the EU, the European Central Bank has provided a $750 billion sort of fund to relieve government debt during the crisis. They're spending $120 billion in quantitative easing, further $20 billion in debt purchases. So, it hasn't matched certainly the US's spending of $2 trillion. But certainly we have seen a big amount of support that's coming through in terms of some fiscal stimulus. Now, I actually should stand corrected here because I've just realised that actually the EU's fiscal response has actually been the largest in the world, which is quite interesting. Again, scope of size. So they had a $3.2 trillion fiscal stimulus outside of what their central bank has done. I think their central bank has clearly done a lot, which is, I think, quite significant. But I think also they're dealing with some economies that have got, large variance as well, which is going to prove to be quite challenging. And I think we can see that, Terry, because if we look at the euro area, you can certainly see that Italy and Spain are going to have significantly bigger reductions in their growth than perhaps Germany and France, despite all countries being quite negatively affected.
I think it's interesting that you do mention Italy and Spain as well, because those are areas where something we haven't talked about today is that coronavirus affects different areas disproportionately, right? And so I know in Italy, it's affecting the northern part of Italy a lot worse than the others, because those are the areas where a lot of the manufacturing is being done. And so there's also that issue as well, like maybe why there's such a large fiscal response is because it needs to be, as we know, that fiscal policy is the more sharper tool, right? And so there is more targeted support for these particular areas as well.
Definitely, that's a very good point. Now, what about, let's look at India and then emerging economies.
Yeah.
What's been happening with India in all of this?
Well, even before, India was, there were talks about how India was going to really, really accelerate their growth. And then last year it kind of slowed down a little bit. And so obviously, you combine that with a crisis such as coronavirus, it's going to just really accelerate that deceleration, if you will. It's going to make it more severe. And so India has had a, much, much slower growth rate of growth. And so the Reserve Bank of India has responded. They've cut the repo rate, which is it safe to invest like their cash rate? That's
right.
Yeah. And so they've cut that to 4.4%, so that it's to encourage more lending, more spending.
I think the positive about India, though, and I think there's a couple of interesting thoughts. One is for Australia for a moment, right? Our sort of plan B, I think, to some extent, has always been, well, if China's growth sort of falls off a cliff, we'll start selling commodities to India because they're the next emergent global, sort of economic powerhouse. And I think clearly due to, I think some, challenges with, politics and bureaucracy and administration within India, that quite hasn't happened as quickly as we would have expected. So they're certainly not at the position, I think, globally that perhaps analysts would have predicted 10 years ago. And I think on the flip side, what's a positive, though, is that India's cash rate's 4.4%. Like, think about where the rest of the world's at. It's on the floor. So I think that the sort of maybe good news here is that there's still much room.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, they got.
And why is that important, Terry? I mean, let's just bring a little bit of monetary policy in here. Like, why is that actually important in India's case?
Well, because if you run out of room, you need to resort to what's known as unconventional monetary policy. Now, have we done a video on this yet?
We have. Yeah, we have.
Okay, I'm losing track. Yeah, but yeah,
watch that video, guys, if you want to learn all about like alternative forms of unconventional monetary policy.
But yeah, like if you've got this room to operate, it just gives you more options, right? Like you've got more capacity to try and use monetary policy in a more meaningful way to stimulate more spending, expenditure, aggregate demand. And so it does give them an opportunity, I guess, to rebound more strongly from this COVID-19.
Definitely. I agree. And I think that's a real positive for Australia, actually, because again, it means that we'll see, hopefully, both India and China, two large economies in arguably, the sort of fairly close proximity to the Australian economy, sort of kicking into gear or at least staying more positive than the rest of the globe. And that's what got us through the GFC, if we think about it. It was the fact that the regional economy stayed stronger and, more insulated from the global impact. And the hope here for Australia, short of us trying to maintain sovereignty despite Chinese pressure, is that that will also help us get through this crisis as well. Now, final thing, just as we sort of move towards wrapping up, there's one sort of group of economies we haven't really looked at, and that's emerging economies. What's been happening with emerging economies, Terry?
So I think I want to kick things off just talking about Africa, because they have really been, for the past couple of years, really knocking on the door, to really make you guys study it, right? Because a lot of, at least in the past, right, in topic one, we don't really go to Africa very much, right? But I think they have been knocking on the door, but they have, with all this, spending and investment in Africa, I think there has also been a bit of some newfound fears of like a debt crisis, right? Because they've over leveraged themselves. I know that China's really heavily invested into Africa. So to bring up that point again with you, their Belt project, right? So there could be some very serious concerns about, how those investments play out if they are so leveraged and so dependent on additional support.
Now, I think when we look at, Africa, right, I think that perhaps positive here is that, well, positive/negative, 80 poor and middle income countries have already sought financial help from the IMF because they've struggled to cope with the fallout. 50 low-income countries and 31 middle-income countries, which is more than 40% of the IMF's 189 members, have been asking for support from the IMF. So I think that's perhaps what's a little scary, right? That 40% of our, 189 members of the IMF are knocking on the door saying, hey, we need financial support, otherwise there's a risk of financial market collapse, which is really one of the key objectives and outcomes that the IMF is responsible for, which is, the stability in global financial markets. Now, it's interesting, I'm curious to see how the World Bank is also going to come to play in all of this, given that, there's a heavily indebted nations initiative as well. And I wonder to what extent, that's also going to play a role in supporting some of these countries. But, again, it's perhaps a little too early to tell. So do you have any final comments, Terry, in terms of, the emerging economies?
I think just overall, like you said, if you're going to look for a stat, go look for an overall one. So we've got here that, even at a very conservative level, right, our estimates to all the total support that's needed just to get these emerging economies who are struggling, get them back on their feet, could be almost $2.5 trillion. And, it's really difficult for them to come up with $2.5 trillion. And so they will probably need to get this support through those international organizations, but then they might even have a little bit of a struggle themselves getting access to those funds, because during a crisis like COVID-19, it's very difficult to find, cheap, accessible capital.
I think a final point to make here is that one of the things that you'll look at as part of, the global economy and inequality in the global economy is the sort of global, investment and the patterns and direction of investment and how that one creates an interconnected economy. But on the other side, it can also create regional differences and perhaps some regionalization. And what's really interesting here is that in most cases, you see that particularly foreign direct investment, but even portfolio, it tends to be attracted to emerging and developed. Right, over your sort of, your developing. And unfortunately, this gets exacerbated during periods of crisis. And so we can see that since, COVID has started creating some turbulence in the financial markets, $83 billion of capital has left emerging markets as investors have sought out the safe havens of more developed economies. Now, that's just from emerging markets, not even developing. So I think it says a lot about just how, that global architecture around, the patterns of investment is also going to, post-COVID, I think, continue to cause growing inequality between some of our developed, emerging, and then developing nations as well. So there we have it, guys. I mean, that's a bit of an overview right now of the emerging impacts that COVID-19 has on the global economy. A couple of things to note. Number one, we'll do some further updates as things continue to progress in terms of impacts on the global economy. So stay tuned for other HSC Economic Review episodes. Secondly, this is the first of a 3-part series that we are shooting. The second, we'll look at, how is COVID impacting Australia specifically? And we've started touching upon it a little bit, but we will do a deep dive, so stay tuned for the next episode. And then finally, we're also going to look at what Australia's COVID economic policy response has been, both at a fiscal level federally, a monetary level federally, and even look at how the states have played a role in trying to support Australia's, hopefully, V-shaped recovery, but that's something that we will unpack in part 3 of this 3-episode series. So stay tuned. If you haven't, hit subscribe so that you'll get further updates, and we will see you in the next episode of HSC Economics Review.